it would not be an exaggeration to say that you can't live in Canada without coming face to face with the Truth and Reconciliation movement. Land acknowledgements, public protests, or even street renamings. The issue goes much deeper than just that, but it is an issue faced by Canadians everywhere, and it is always present in our politics. Most recently, this issue blew up over the Cowichan ruling, where a BC Supreme Court gave Aboriginal title to certain areas within Richmond, British Columbia, throwing into question home ownership in that area. Where does the Truth and Reconciliation movement end? What does it mean for First Nations Canadians and for you? Well, those are the questions that I aim to answer in this podcast. All right, so joining me now is Aaron Peat, the chief of the Chawathil First Nation in British Columbia and the host of the Nuanced podcast. Aaron, thanks so much for joining me.
The pleasure is all mine.
I want to first start with the Cowichan ruling out in Richmond, British Columbia. This is setting off a ton of alarm bells because a BC Supreme Court ruling basically throws into question the validity and ownership of BC residents, Richmond residents, over their homes. I know you've spoken about this at length, but for those that aren't aware, can you talk to me about what this Cowichan ruling means for the residents of Richmond and also for members of the Cowichan First Nation?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. So this decision is a very long decision and years in the making. It sounds like it was going on. It's one of the longest court cases ever. And it outlines a claim that Aboriginal title predates the land title system in British Columbia. And that dispute is very technical, but for everyday citizens in Richmond, it has put a lot of stress and I think pressure on them in regards to how does this impact them. And I think that question is somewhat complicated because it depends on a variety of factors. I think the key piece is that there's no eviction notices. And that seems to be where a lot of concern is coming from, that does this put my ownership in dispute? It puts it in dispute in relationship with the First Nation community and the government, and they need to have a conversation about that. And it's worth noting that the Tishel Colton case did the same thing, but in a rural area. And so a lot of legal experts believed a decision like this would eventually arise, where something would happen in an urban setting. But it sounds like a lot of guardrails weren't put into place. First, it sounds like, based on Premier David Eby's comments, he thought that the decision would be a little bit more restricted than it was. That could have been his mistake. That could have been a misunderstanding. I'm not sure. But that piece was missed. And second, we didn't really prepare to have a conversation about this, which I think was a huge error. Because everybody's reacting, the city of Richmond is reacting, the province is reacting, but this is not a best practice when we talk about provincial policy and reconciliation more generally. And I think that's where my concern comes from, is if we're going to have a conversation about how we resolve these issues, we should have brought British Columbians along a long time ago. And so this is the first time Aboriginal title is really being discussed at scale, and a lot of people don't have the legal understanding of previous cases that have brought us here. And so it looks like an anomaly when really the case law was really building up to this type of conversation. And I think there's a path to resolving this that has been treaty in the past, and a lot of governments have chosen not to take that path. And so I guess the most important point that I would share with your viewers who may not agree with me or like what I have to say, but this has been a long-standing question since the West met Indigenous people. There have been long-standing acknowledgements that this is First Nations land and that needs to be resolved. The title was inherent in points like the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and we've not resolved the issue. In other provinces, they have resolved these issues through treaty. British Columbia chose not to resolve this with First Nations at the time through treaties. They chose to avoid the question, and now it's coming up through case law, which I do not think is the best place to resolve issues like this.
It seems to me, from my perspective, that this current trajectory that we are on regarding reconciliation, because I'm going to lump this into a broader reconciliation issue, the Cowichan ruling. It seems to me that if this keeps going, it's not sustainable. I don't just mean with the ruling, of course, but also with the increasingly large payments by settlement to First Nations communities. Do you see a way in which this era of reconciliation that we are in comes to an end? And if so, what does that look like?
So boldly, I'll say from the outset, I believe that the reconciliation project should have milestones and markers so that we know where we're heading and how to get there. And examples of that would look like addressing the lack of education rates in First Nation communities, addressing the poverty that exists on reserves in First Nation communities, making sure that every British Columbian and Canadian has opportunities to be successful. And so without those benchmarkers, I think to your point, we aren't really sure how close we are or how far we are from resolving some of these disputes. And I think it's challenged more by the fact, and this would be my critique of a lot of these reconciliation agreements that have been signed, is they don't make it clear what an end process would look like between the province and First Nation communities. And I think that's a question that's rightly asked by many people, is where are we going and how do we know when we're going to get there? And that's a missing piece of this conversation. And if that continues to be the approach we take, I do think that this is not going to be a successful project, because people cannot support something indefinitely and they cannot invest indefinitely not knowing what resolutions might look like. Now, that said, I'm glad that people want to start to look at these questions and start to try and find answers. But I'll say that I think from many First Nation communities' perspectives, they have been beating the drum on that the loudest, and nobody has wanted to listen to them for a very long time. And I think that's some of the frustration you see in First Nation leaders, is we have wanted to develop a roadmap. We have wanted a clear process for treaty or resolutions, and we have not gotten willing partners from the province or the federal government. And so we get these kind of piecemeal opportunities, but it also has not been our preference to take that approach across many communities. That has been what we have been given, and so that's the deal we've agreed to make because that's what we're being offered. And I think that's an important piece, that it's not like First Nations get to decide what agreements 100% they're going to enter into. They are given opportunities, and they take advantage of those. But the end date has been a decision by different governments not to try and work towards or agree upon.
You mentioned at the beginning of that answer some of the issues faced by First Nations Canadians and across the country. And I know that First Nations are not a political monolith. There is disagreement and debate on many issues. But maybe you can just speak within your own First Nation. What are some of the biggest political issues and social issues that are being debated right now and that are top of mind for your members?
That's a really interesting question. For my community, I think the focus is economic development, finding prosperity, addressing the living conditions on reserve. Those are the concerns that I've heard that they want addressed, and that's what we've been working on. We have 89 homes within my First Nation community. We've renovated 42 of those, or are renovating those homes, and we're working on doing all of them. That's 40 years of homes that have not seen any substantial investment to address the living conditions. That's mold, mildew, and the challenge, again, for some of your viewers that might not know, is you don't actually get to own your land in a First Nation community. You can have what's called a certificate of possession, but you cannot sell the land. And so you have a parcel of land that you live on and a house that may have been invested in by others, but there's no financial value in investing in a home on reserve because it's much more applicable like a car. When you buy a house, the thing that actually appreciates the most is the land that your house is sitting on, not the house itself. That's a depreciating asset overall. And so the challenge that many First Nation communities have is there's no drive to want to invest in housing on reserve because you don't own that land. It's not going to appreciate, it's going to depreciate. And so we've worked with the federal government previously to try and address housing on reserve because of those gaps that, again, were driven by others. And so those are the concerns that I hear specifically from my community. And I think my broader concern is often that the conversations we're having at the political level often are completely disconnected from the living conditions that First Nations are actually facing. When we're debating the Cowichan decision, when we're debating the the history of residential schools, those debates often take away, or land acknowledgements, these debates often take away from the fact that my community members, I often don't hear concerned about these types of issues. There's interest in what the Cowichan decision means, but broadly, there's not a political sense of like, well, David Eby thinks this and John Rustad thinks this, and this is how we're all thinking about it. It's often, I just want to be able to feed my kids. I don't have enough food in the fridge. And when you look at the inflationary policies of the past 10 years, that impacts people on fixed incomes. That impacts people on social assistance, on pensions. And so those are many of my community members. And so this cost of living crisis impacts them more substantially than many Canadians. It impacts all of us, but impacts them more because it just means their $300 a month to go buy groceries is going less and less in terms of its distance and its ability to feed their families.
So how do you create wealth on reserves? And does that include being open to projects like pipelines and natural resource projects? I'm sure it extends beyond that, but how exactly do you go about doing that? Just creating prosperity on reserve.
It's an interesting question. So I would say first, many First Nations have different opportunities within their region, like a Soyuz Indian Band and Clarence Louis. They have taken an approach because of their location to be able to do a lot of growing of apples and different fruits, creating wineries, creating hotels within their region. And so Clarence Louis, who I had the opportunity to interview, shared a lot of insights on economic development and the importance of that if we're going to continue to fund social programs within the community. That many communities, I think, are working towards self-reliance. We do not want to be reliant on the federal or provincial government. That is the goal, because we know that the winds change depending on the political leaders, and we want that independence for ourselves. And so that's an example of a Soyuz. Up north and in Alberta, you see a lot more investments in pipelines and a lot more eagerness to participate. And then within other First Nation communities like Musqueam, Tsayuwaltooth, and Squamish, they're looking, I think, at housing as a primary opportunity. They're building large-scale developments with 99-year lease systems. Now, personally, I do not like that model. I think that process is much more of a rent-geared system than an ownership system, and I think it's important that we continue to put pressure on our federal and provincial counterparts to focus on making sure that people can own a home. That is something we should not allow governments to move the promise of home ownership on, and so those types of pieces arrive. I think it's a short-term solution that will bring in revenue for those First Nation communities, and more power to them. But I think the long-term play that they're going to run into is that is actually not a desirable asset in comparison to true home ownership. So it depends on the region. My region, we're looking a lot more at tourism because we have Othello tunnels, because we have 3 major highways interacting, because we have a river. And so it's important that communities have that conversation and also talk to their members about what jobs and opportunities they want. Then you write an economic development plan. Then you start meeting with industry and private investors to figure out how you can bring those opportunities to life and support people in full-time employment.
When it comes to settlement payments and how money gets brought into First Nations communities and a First Nation in general, I've spoken to people who work at a provincial political level, and one frustration they tell me is that when there is settlement money that goes to First Nations communities, instead of that money being invested into long-term infrastructure projects on reserve, it gets individually sent out to members. And there is a view that sometimes that is used to curry favor for elections and votes. I just want to know from your perspective, how does it work when your First Nation receives money from a federal or provincial government involved in a settlement? How does that money then get dispersed, and how does that process work?
It's an important point. I'm not going to avoid the fact that some First Nation communities fall into the example that you're describing, and that issue needs to be addressed. The First Nations Financial Transparency Act was tabled. It has not been pushed forward. It should be. We are elected officials. We have a fiduciary duty not only to our memberships, but if we're stewarding federal or provincial dollars, we need to live up to the obligations as politicians to make sure that money is stewarded properly. to the piece about per capita distribution, that's been and continues to be a community-led decision. And as communities advance, often they work towards exactly what you're describing, a community trust or some sort of process. I know Williams Lake has one where when they get money, their members vote on exactly what they want to do with it. In lieu of that, it's been per capita distributions. And I don't think anybody would dispute that model isn't really sustainable or effective, but at times it's what the membership asks for. And so ultimately, when those settlements are being arrived to, it's been the First Nation community that has been aggrieved for some sort of wrongdoing. An example would be they were promised a reserve about a certain size and the federal government gave it away. And in lieu of not receiving that land, they receive a cash payment. If the members vote to want to receive a cash payment, that is within their right and follows the proper best practices. But communities that are strategic look at community trusts or investments in infrastructure or other pieces to address those issues. The challenge in just focusing on infrastructure is that, say for my community, half live on reserve, half live all around the world. And so if I invest in just doing infrastructure projects, that really doesn't benefit half of the community. And so you have to find some sort of balance that serves both those ends. So right now we're doing conversations about a community trust. What does that look like? What would the members like to see that put into? And how do we actually live up to that 7 generations principle? Because I don't think we're far away from each other. I think I've always believed there's things First Nations can learn from the West, and there's things the West can learn from First Nations. And 2 examples would be, one, First Nations are much better at caring about their elders than the West is, as we saw in 2020. The West did not do a good job at caring about their elderly people. The second piece is trying to make collective decisions that work for everybody and that benefit people over a 7-generation horizon. As you see, politicians rarely, if ever, are able to think out 5, 10, 20, 30 years and make good decisions based on that. And I think the 7 generations principle that we as First Nations leaders are called to follow aligns much more with that. And so there are certainly challenges. We're adopting a system and learning from a system that we have not had 100 years to work with. We are learning things through osmosis rather than being able to go read why people made those types of decisions and following like case law and stuff. Like I've had the benefit of learning how the West operates through case law, and it can go back 130 years as to why someone made a decision and how that shapes and has changed over 150 years. Many First Nations don't have that access to that original information as to why this worked. Like I believe in electoral politics. I believe in democracy. Some communities have hereditary chiefs. That's very different than my philosophy because I understand the value of a democracy. I understand the value of people being able to vote for who's going to represent them. And some communities just either haven't done that research or disagree with the findings of that research, and that's their prerogative. But I think there's just things we can both learn from each other.
There's something you bring up when you describe the West and First Nations communities. It's a perfect segue to this next question, which is questions around identity and Canadian identity within First Nations communities. I'm curious, do you find that people within your community and other First Nations communities that I'm sure you're close with, do they feel Canadian or do they feel members of their First Nation first and just happen to have Canadian citizenship by being where they are? Because I think you know what I'm trying to get at. When you mention, the West and First Nations, I just want to know what is the sentiment that you've seen surrounding questions of Canadian identity?
I have seen a healthy, normal balance. I've certainly seen the loudest voices come out like against. I think when the mass grave story came out, a lot of people rejected Canada Day. I don't think that was a uniquely First Nations piece. I think there's a constant question, particularly for democratic countries, of what does it mean to be a Canadian? And I think we've seen that more so with these Trump tariffs. Like, what exactly are we fighting against in terms of these tariffs? What does it mean to be an American versus a Canadian? And I don't think a lot of people have tremendous answers to that question. I think it's an important question, and I think there are good answers to it. And so I think a lot of First Nations people see themselves as both and don't particularly. I think there's stains on Canadian history that First Nations would raise and point out, but I don't think they view themselves as un-Canadian. And I don't, it's an interesting question. Do they view themselves as more like Chawathil First Nation or more a First Nation person than a Canadian? I wouldn't say so. I think most First Nations people consider themselves like Indigenous and then maybe Canadian, and proudly identify as that. And I think one of the reasons you might see that is just it has been a challenge to be proud to be that for such a long time, that there's an uptick in pride. I think you see that as the same with the tariffs and Canadians. There's an uptick in Canadian sentiment when it's challenged, and I think now, for the past 10 years, it has been in vogue to be Indigenous. And that looks like it may be changing. It looks like we're in a lot of political disagreements around Indigenous people. But I think that pride and that willingness to put that title first is likely coming from a fact that it has not been an easy thing to be an Indigenous person over the past 100 years. And to your viewers who likely will go, well, it hasn't been easy to be anything over the past 100 years, I agree with that as well. It has been a challenging time throughout human history for many different cultures and communities.
When it comes to the Indian Act, I know there is significant debate about whether it should be abolished or it should be, reformed. What is your perspective? Should the government pursue abolishing the Indian Act?
I would support that. Of course, the question is what comes next, but I think it was a racist policy when it was introduced, and it's a racist policy today. I often have enjoyed people, particularly in the US, challenging the idea of systemic racism. Like, what is that? Define it. Where is it? How do we actually address it? And I think the Indian Act is just one of those laws that is inherently racist and has had many racist policies put into it. And so I would support the abolishment of it. I would just ask what comes next.
If that were to happen, what would you like to see after that?
I honestly don't know. I try to avoid these types of questions just because so many, like, treaty communities are going to have a completely different perspective than my community, and other First Nation communities are going to disagree with my claim that we shouldn't have the Indian Act. And so I don't often think about where I would go because we're so far away from either of those things happening, that I try and stay within the next 5 years, and I don't foresee that being something that arises in the near future. But what I would like to see is Indigenous people, like all other cultures, able to be proud of who they are. I would like to make sure that all First Nation communities are given the opportunity to be successful, to become contributing members of society, and to share their gifts and knowledge and culture with everybody else like any other community does, and to make sure that there is a special recognition that they've been here since time immemorial and that they have been stewarding these lands, that there are beautiful stories about the culture and history that kind of get lost when we start debating these cases and the legal pieces, which are important to debate. But I think that disconnects us, and we've done, over the past 150 years, we've done a lot of First Nations versus with the West and which one is worse, and attacking it from that lens. I'd like to look at what are the beauty of both cultures and how do we intertwine our societies together.
Well, I'm going to switch gears here and bring up something that I know you've spoken about, you've debated about, and that is residential school denialism, in particular MP Leah Gazan's recent motion to amend the criminal code to include residential school denialism. That doesn't just mean denying the existence of residential schools, which I think barely anyone does. I think it also involves questioning the severity or downplaying elements of the residential school story. You have publicly opposed this motion, and I want to get you to explain why.
Oh, I'm against it because I am pro free speech. I believe that's the fundamental piece of any healthy democracy. Two, I think there are legitimate questions about a specific story. Three, I think I might be caught up in this legislation because I do interview and debate people who do have questions, who do challenge what has taken place. And then four, I think First Nations have been arguing for truth and reconciliation for a very long time. And I think us saying we don't want to debate the truth anymore is not reflective of what our ancestors and what our elders fought for so long. We have to be willing to debate these people. And I disagree with many, but I've debated them, and I haven't seen a lot of bad faith. I have not interviewed yet the people I believe operate in some level of bad faith. I've had the opportunity to speak with people who I think have legitimate challenges and questions. And I think the challenge that I see, the root of why this has gotten out of hand, and I know people think this might be trite or irresponsible, but I think if universities were the institutions we want them to be in terms of truth-seeking mechanisms, I think we could have honest debates about exactly these types of issues without it becoming polarized. And I think because they're not serving their purpose, and I tried to make this point to Francis Widdowson, I believe if we could go do it there, we don't have to go into a First Nation community and debate with the people who went through those experiences in order to have a healthy conversation about what a middle ground conversation looks like. I think the fact that we don't have that means we do it on YouTube channels and out in public, and that just results in a lot of people who aren't ready for that conversation being exposed to that conversation, and they're not the target audience for such a conversation. And that they have, like, when I speak to my elders within my community, they have no interest in my perspective on it. They went through something very real for themselves. It would be similar to somebody who has survived a war. Like, I don't need to go tell them I read a book about war and here's what you experienced. Like, they don't need that. They're good. They understand what they went through. But the academic and technical conversation about what exactly happened, what was the policy, and how did it impact people, and are there unmarked graves? I think those are legitimate conversations that should happen in a healthy institution and in a healthy society that aren't taking place right now.
Do you feel like there is that since the Kamloops claim and since this issue really blew up across the country, do you feel like it has contributed to a growing divide between First Nations and the broader Canadian public? Because from my perspective, this has really backfired on what I think was probably a positive direction we were heading in. I feel like this unmarked grave story and the residential schools coming back into national consciousness has made it worse in many ways for relations between First Nations and the broader Canadian public. Do you share that same sentiment?
Yes. I would say that I see three key pieces. One, from the outset of our conversation, I don't think reconciliation has had good guardrails. And so when people start learning about these issues, they go, okay, where are we going here? And where's the end point? And what's the plan? And how much are we spending? And how do we make sure that the money is well spent? And all of these questions. And Canadians have not, and British Columbians have not been involved in those types of conversations. So it came as kind of a shock when the unmarked grave story came out. I think there was a national reckoning. I think that was an important milestone. But to your point, it was connected to something that really harmed the underlying understanding. Many people just came to understand, oh my God, like I had no idea kids died at these schools at all. I had no idea that like children were abused in these schools at all. And so it came with a lot of, like 80% was very useful, important information that a lot of Canadians just didn't realize the gravity of the situation. But since it was tied to this story, now that we kind of comb through it and double check our work and great journalists are willing to ask tough questions, we're now at this point of like, okay, some people are going, well, how much of this is nonsense? And that's where I think we're going a little bit off the rails. And then third, this Cowichan case also puts a lot of questions into, is it First Nations versus the West? Is it First Nations versus British Columbians and Canadians? Is that the framing of it? And because we're not having healthy dialogues and because our government is not willing to have a fulsome conversation and sit down and do a Q&A and answer real questions about how we're going to get through this, I think that's created a greater divide where a lot of Canadians who can't afford a home, who can barely put food in their fridge, who are stressed out about paying their utility bills, are going, hold on, and now the place that I'm finally paying off is also in disrepute, and I don't know what's going to happen with that. I think that's just too much during this economic time for people to manage. And that my nuanced perspective is we're able to have conversations about the economy, about climate change, about Indigenous issues, about social issues, when the economy is healthy. when the economy is unhealthy, we do not have the mental space to have those types of conversations. And we are there right now. We are in a very uncertain fiscal time. People do not know what's going to happen with their employment. People do not know where the economy is heading. And there's a lot of fear. And so you add to that these different conversations. And I think it does create a divide that we need to discuss through. I have a lot of people telling me to stop having these conversations. But I really think if somebody doesn't fill the gap and say, we can work this out together, that we are going to end up as a very divided nation, and that Indigenous people are going to be the ones on the out, not being able to have good conversations because people are going to think they are the enemy, and I just don't think that's the case.
Right. And this question is one that I think comes up, and it gets hinted at on social media comments, and it doesn't really ever get addressed. And that is to go over the issues that are faced by First Nations communities and individuals that can be attributed to past government wrongs, that can be attributed to intergenerational trauma, and the issues that can't and that need to be addressed by First Nations groups within themselves. I want to ask you where you think that line ends. The issues that the government should take responsibility on, and those that frankly need to be addressed within First Nations groups.
That's a excellent question. I would say for too long, in my opinion, I wrote an article in the Hub outlining that I think chiefing councils and leadership across Canada hold much more responsibility than journalists and politicians let them get away with. I think we do have an onus to our community. Before I was elected, there was no plan to address the quality of housing and the amount of housing on reserve. And so those two pieces needed to be addressed. And I think it's an important piece that First Nations should have conversations with the provincial and federal government about what is fair. I really personally appreciate the investment John Horgan and David Eby have made in regards to Indigenous housing on reserve. That's a gap that other provinces have chosen not to get involved in, but what it means and how it can be pitched to everyday British Columbians is we have a lot of homeless people, a lot of homeless Indigenous people living in municipalities and urban areas as a consequence of the lack of housing on reserve. And so if you allow us, if you trust us, if you invest in us, we can bring those members home, we can reconnect them with their community, we can get them an education, and we can get them to be contributing members of society. But if you leave them in public housing in an urban center like Vancouver or Surrey, they are not going to have that community. They are going to feel like a weight on society. And that model has not worked. And so that would be my pitch on an issue like housing. On healthcare, we have support from First Nations Health Authority, which receives funding from the province and the federal government to make sure it's adapted and to make sure that the health outcomes for Indigenous people are addressed in a different way than everyday Canadians, because the rate of addiction, the rate of suicide ideation, the rate of substance misuse and all of those things are worse. And so we have an adapted plan with First Nation leaders supporting it to support those members. And so I think it's a case-by-case basis, but I think it should always be able to be pitched to everyday British Columbians or Canadians as to why that's going to be effective and why it's going to improve the social fabric for everybody involved, not just for Indigenous people. And the fact that people just see numbers going out to First Nation communities with no real plan or no real pitch as to how this benefits British Columbians or Canadians, I think is the gap that's missing. And so I don't have a perfect, these three things, but I think those are the main pieces as to how I think we have that conversation.
I don't want to end this on a negative note, but I do want to ask you, looking forward, do you see the potential for First Nations issues to boil over like they did with the Oka crisis and Caledonia in Ontario, where there is not conflict, but the serious potential for there to be conflict over land disputes and over issues? Or do you see cooler heads prevailing in the future?
I see cooler heads prevailing, And I don't foresee any of that type of energy. I know, particularly with the Cowichan decision, Musqueam and Tsawwatil and others dispute their claim. And so I know that there's disagreements even within First Nation communities about this. And I think because the decision is being appealed, I think many First Nations are seeing, like, we have to do this in a way that's collaborative. And again, I don't exactly know what happened in the rooms where it was decided not to communicate this to British Columbians as the trial was taking place. But I think had we brought British Columbians in 10 years ago when the case was starting and started to have this discussion, I think we'd be at a much more middle ground. But I don't think governments of both sides, my understanding was it was originally John Rustad who was holding the file when this case started. I think the decision by all governments not to bring in British Columbians into this conversation was very unwise and irresponsible. Even if they don't want to participate, some do, and some are very concerned about this. And so that gap, I think, was the mistake. I don't see this getting out of hand, but I do think we need stronger political leadership who are willing to have tough conversations, get a lot of negative comments, get a lot of people frustrated in order to say what they believe is the truth and adapt where necessary. And what I'm seeing from both sides of the aisle is political grandstanding rather than, okay, like, let's sit down and try and figure out what a middle ground looks like. How do we get everybody on the same page? And those conversations are tough. People are scared. But I think avoiding them, you see a lot more of a political lightning rod when you start to touch these stories. And I think that's the balance we need to put pressure on our leaders to start to address, is how do we come back together? We just had a big, scary decision. How do we all come back to the table and start to figure out the path forward?
Aaron, where can Canadians find more of your work?
I host a podcast called Nuanced. It's on YouTube, Spotify. I do specific breakdowns on issues like the Cowichan decision, on the unmarked grave story. They're like an hour long. I just did one on the 2025 budget, and I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, all of those things. Thank you so much for having me, Harrison. It's been a pleasure, and you have incredible questions, so kudos to you.
Oh, thank you. We'll put a link to your show on YouTube in the description of this video, and we'll leave it there. Aaron, thank you again for joining me, man. I really appreciate it.
The honor is all mine.